Hi Year 9. So here is another lesson on spectacles. So we are going to revise aristocracy. So which member or which character is a member of the aristocracy in an spectacles? So of all the characters we've met so far, who is a member of the aristocracy and how do we know? And our new word today is individualist. And we're going to think about how Mr Birling is presented as an individualist in the play that we've read so far. So let's look at what individualist is then, although the clue is in the word. So an individualist is someone who believes you should just take care of yourself and focus on your own needs. So think about how an individualist might contrast with someone that believes in socialism. So essentially individualism and socialism are completely opposite. Socialism is about the group, it's about the collective body of people together, whereas individualism is about this every man or individual for themselves, not really caring about how their actions affect other people. So think about how Mr Birling has been presented so far as an individualist. You can pause the video and have a go at answering those questions. So Gerald is the member of the aristocracy that we have been presented to so far. We know this because Mr Birling is trying to ingratiate, is trying to suck up to him to give a good impression. We know that Gerald is just the sort of son-in-law Mr Birling has always wanted, and that through Sheila marrying Gerald, she is going to become the new Lady Croft and therefore a member of the aristocracy, which will raise the social profile of the whole Birling family. So how has Mr Birling been presented as an individualist so far? Well, it hasn't been obvious as of yet, although you'll see as we read a little bit more of the play, his individualist behaviour is very, very clear. Mr Birling, as we know, is a capitalist. We know that he's a prosperous manufacturer, as we hear in the opening stage directions. And capitalism, as we have learnt, is about the individual pursuit for wealth. So someone like Priestley, who believed in what Priestley believed in, would believe that as he is a capitalist, he is therefore an individualist. Because Priestley and others who believed like Priestley, their biggest issue with capitalism is that it was about your own personal selfish gain rather than the collective good of the whole population, essentially. So that is how Mr Birling is presented as an individualist, because of his capitalist ideals. So we've looked there. So our knowledge goal today is to explore and evaluate how Priestley uses deliberate language choices to present Mr Birling in his big speech in Act 1. So Mr Birling is going to give a big speech today, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. So by the end of the lesson, you will know the historically significant moments in history between 1912 and 1945. Remember, Priestley wrote the play in 1945, but deliberately chose to set the play in 1912, 2 years before World War I. And he did that for some very deliberate reasons that we're going to explore today. We're also going to consider how Priestley manipulates the audience into disliking Mr Birling's character through his reference to these historic events. Okay? So let's think then about some of the historically significant events between 1912 and 1945 that we're going to hear Mr Birling refer to. And remember, the audience sitting watching the play in 1946 would know truly what happened with all of these things, because they happen after 1912 but before 1945. So trade union strikes. When we did the context lesson, you would have learned a little bit about trade unions. Now, as we know, the poor, the working class, worked in factories, they worked down coal mines, they did unskilled labour, basically. And we also know that there were no real right. They had no real workers' rights. They could be paid whatever the going rate was, basically as little as the employer could get away with paying them. They weren't entitled to sick pay, weren't entitled to holidays, weren't, you know, there was no protection for your average worker. Now, around 1912, you know, and a bit before 1912 as well, there was the beginnings of this idea of a trade union. Now, a trade union is a organisation that you can join as a worker, and that union supports you, and that union works on your behalf to protect your rights. Now, as you can imagine, factory owners or capitalists like Mr Birling and even Gerald and his father, they didn't like trade unions very much, because trade unions meant that they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. They couldn't treat these poor workers however they wanted. They actually had to, you know, pay them a fair wage and treat them decently. But, you know, trade unions did not have that sort of power in 1912. There was still very much in the employers, so someone like Mr Birling's favour. But what we did begin to see is strikes. Now, a strike is when the whole people that might work somewhere, say a factory, would all decide that they were going to stop working, they weren't going to go back to work as a big group until something changed. For example, they were given a pay rise. So we see, you know, this beginnings of this movement of workers trying to stick up for their rights, which is really important when this is a play about capitalism, socialism, social class, because what you have here is the working class is trying to stand up for themselves. So that's one really important thing that was going on at the time. What we also have is the sinking of the Titanic. Now, in 1912, the Titanic, which, as I'm sure the vast majority of you know, was the biggest ship, you know, commercial ship, meaning that people could pay to go on it, this luxury ship that was going to sail to America. And it was considered to be unsinkable because of the material it was made out of, the way it had been engineered. And as we know, very tragically, they struck an iceberg and the Titanic sank. Now, what's really interesting about the fact that we're going to hear Mr Birling refer to the Titanic is that those in 1946 obviously knew what would have happened to the Titanic, but they would have known that predominantly the people who died were the working class. And there's, you know, lots of very famous stories about them locking the lower class passengers on their deck, so the wealthy could get into the lifeboats first, because of course the tragedy with the Titanic is that because it was considered unsinkable, there weren't enough lifeboats, and unfortunately lots and lots of people died, and many of those that died were the poor. They were working class passengers. So again, it's no accident that Priestley has chosen the reference to the Titanic. Not only was it a massive tragedy, it was a tragedy that affected the working class more than the wealthy. Incidentally, I don't know if it's on Amazon Prime or Netflix or whatever streaming service you may have, but watching the film Titanic, the good old cheesy Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet Titanic, would actually be a really good contextual exercise to watch to understand the social class and the context of an Inspector Calls. So if you feel like watching a epic tearjerker with a slice of cheesiness, then maybe sit and get your family together and a bowl of popcorn and watch the Titanic and learn about social class. Anyway, I'm digressing. So of course you have World War I and World War II, and we know that World War I started just 2 years after this play is set, and then of course, very tragically, not that long afterwards, was equally World War II, and we know Priestley wrote this play at the end of World War II. So these are 4 big significant events which happened, which the audience, both in 1946 and us today as an audience, we know all about these things. Mr Birling, however, sitting in 1912 making this big speech, does not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a clip that I originally recorded for Year 10 which has me reading and then annotating Mr Birling's speech. Now, attached to the email would have been a copy of Mr Birling's speech that you're going to do your independent task on tomorrow, although I'll explain that later. So if you have access to a printer at home, then feel free to print this out and annotate it along with me. If you don't, please don't worry, just follow the link on follow the annotation, me annotating it on video on your screen, and you can just jot down some of your own notes. Remember, we are going to do all of this play, annotate, read the whole thing together when we are back in class. Okay, so please don't worry if you don't have a physical copy in front of you. So as you listen to me annotate the speech, I want you to have a think about what you feel about what Mr Birling is saying. So think about the historical events he mentions. What's his opinion of them? How does this link to what the audience in 1946 would know is historically accurate? So hopefully I can head over and this will work.
I'm delighted about this engagement. Well, we know why he's delighted, don't we? Because it's going to raise his social status. And I hope it won't be too long before you're married. And I want to say this. There's a good deal of silly talk about these days, but I speak as a hard-headed businessman who has to take risks and know what he's about. So he's very, very self-important, Mr Birling. He thinks just because he's a capitalist, that means that he knows everything about everything. You know, no one can surprise him because he's really wise and knowledgeable. So he's coming across as very pompous, very arrogant. Okay? Pompous is a good word to use to describe Mr Birling. It means someone who's very self-important. You can ignore all this silly pessimistic talk. So pessimistic is looking on like the bad side of things. When you marry, you'll be marrying at a very good time. Yes, a very good time. So think about it. It's 1912. It's not really a very good time to get married because in 2 years' time it's going to be the most devastating war the world has ever seen. So again, all the way through this speech, we have, to help if I can spell it properly, dramatic irony. The audience in 1946 or later knows that it is not, excuse me, going to be a very good time at all. And it will be an even better time. So he's being made to look like a complete idiot, really, like a fool. Because we know that it's not a very good time. Last month, because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble in the near future. Don't worry, we've passed the worst of it. We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. And we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity. So we've got two things we're going to talk about here, the miners and then the interests of capital. So what we have here, again, is this sort of capitalist ideology. Okay? They need to protect businesses. They need to protect profit. They're not interested in protecting people, protecting their workers, because they don't care about them. Again, steadily increasing prosperity. That is ironic, because so many businesses were completely decimated and destroyed in the war. So it is not going to be a time of steadily increasing prosperity, gain. So now we've got the miners came out on strike. Now the miners is obviously referring to people in the coal mines. And this idea of striking, so a worker, if they are not happy with their working conditions or their pay, they can refuse to go to work and almost manipulate that company into meeting their wishes. So this idea of going on strike wasn't something capitalists liked very much, and they were worried that if more and more people went out on strike, then business could come to a standstill. You know, they might actually have to pay their workers decent wages. Priestley would have approved of strikes. This is the sort of thing he thought the poor should do. Again, like William Blake, who was writing, you know, a long time before Priestley, wanted the people to rise up and change. You know, in him, vote for the Labour Party. The Labour Party will create trade unions, they'll protect your jobs, they'll make sure you get paid a fair wage, you know, they will support you, the workers, the working class. And remember, this is a piece of political propaganda. We are supposed to be converted from our capitalist ideology to a socialist one. Okay, so far, Mr Birling is looking like a complete fool, who's completely arrogant and pompous and doesn't know what he's talking about. So, Gerald says, I believe you're right, sir. So, lo and behold, Gerald agrees. He's also a capitalist. He thinks that everything Mr Birling says is right. But his son, Eric, says, what about war? Now, this is really interesting. He's not agreeing with his father. It shows there's hope for Eric. Okay, there's hope for him. He doesn't necessarily believe the same sort of nonsense that his father, even though he's been brought up by him. Glad you mentioned it, Eric, I'm coming to that. Just because the Kaiser, so that's obviously who rules the Germans, made a speech or two, or a few German officers have had too much to drink and begin talking nonsense. Talking there. You'll hear some people say that war's inevitable. And to that I say, fiddlesticks. The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war except some half-civilised folks in the Balkans. And why? There's too much at stake these days. Everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. Now, if you are someone who has possibly lived through World War I and World War II, you are not going to be feeling very favourable towards Mr Birling here. You are not going to be thinking, this is a good guy. This is a guy that knows what he's talking about. You're going to be angry. You're going to dislike him. You know, he's a fool. He's dislikable. He is not somebody Priestley wants us to like, because remember, Birling represents capitalism and we're not supposed to like capitalism. He uses fiddlesticks, a really, you know, flippant, silly word. Almost like he's diminishing the importance of war. So again, the dramatic irony of an audience in 1946. He's so sure of himself. He has no idea the devastation in 2 years' time that is about to hit everything, again, the whole world. Eric says, yes, I know, but still. So again, we see this idea of him disagreeing with his father. He's not comfortable with what Mr Birling is saying, so Priestley's hinting, just like he's done with Sheila not agreeing with what Mrs Birling says about these misogynistic comments about women just having to put up with how they're treated by their husbands. We see that the younger generation, there is some hope. Okay, so we'll look at his next little bit. Just let me finish, Eric. You've a lot to learn yet. So it's very patronising towards his son. You know, oh, you don't know, you've got a lot to learn. I'm talking as a hard-headed, practical man of business. So, again, Priestley's reminding us, as if we could forget, that he's a capitalist. He thinks just because he's a capitalist, he knows everything. And I say there isn't a chance of war. So he's coming right out and saying, war will not happen. The world's developing so fast that it'll make war impossible. Look at the progress we're making. In a year or two, we'll have aeroplanes that will be able to go anywhere. Yes, all the easier to make war completely devastating and drop bombs on everybody. And look at the way the automobile's making headway. Bigger and faster all the time. And then ships. Why, a friend of mine went over this new liner out last week, the Titanic. She sails next week. 46,800 tons. New York in 5 days, and every luxury, and unsinkable. Absolutely unsinkable. That's what you've got to keep your eye on. Facts like that. Now, again, we know that the Titanic was one of the greatest disasters. And if, you know, you're stuck with what to do, stuck at home, try and see if you can get hold of the film Titanic. Okay, not only to, you know, possibly swoon ladies at Leonardo DiCaprio, but because actually in terms of social class, it will give you a lot of contextual information about the rich and the poor. So that may well be worth watching while you're at home. So the Titanic was one of the greatest disasters, and who was it that suffered the most? The working class and the poor were the ones who suffered. They were the ones predominantly who died. They were the ones who were trapped downstairs at the bottom of a sinking ship so the rich could get to the lifeboats. So again, Priestley hasn't done this accidentally. He's not only wanting to continue with this idea that Mr Birling is a fool, he's pompous, he's self-important, he's a capitalist, which means that he thinks he knows everything. He's wanting to, again, use the Titanic to show that the way the rich treat the poor and view the poor is completely wrong. So that's what you've got to keep your eye on. Facts like that, progress like that. Not a few German officers talking nonsense and a few scaremongerers here making a fuss about nothing. Now you 3 young people just listen to this and remember what I'm telling you now. In 20 or 30 years time, let's say in 1940, right smack bam in the middle of World War II, you may be giving a little party like this. Your son or daughter might be getting engaged, and I tell you, by that time, you'll be living in a world that will have forgotten all these capital versus labour agitations and all these silly little war scares. There'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere, except, of course, in Russia, which will always be behindhand naturally. So, Priestley, again, is being very clever and emotionally manipulative here. We know that the audience in 1946 would have suffered, again, devastation in World War II. If anyone is getting engaged in the 1940s, they would not have forgotten all of the, you know, miners' strikes, the rise of trade unions, all of the troubles that happened there. They would not have forgotten the wars. There will not be peace and prosperity. There will, in fact, be the total opposite. The world has to pick itself up off the ground and really try and repair itself from the devastation of both wars. So he's been presented as a complete fool. So Mrs Birling says, Arthur, and as Mrs Birling shows signs of interrupting, yes, my dear, I know I'm talking too much, but you youngsters just remember what I said. So again, patronising, arrogant. We can't let these Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wellses do all the talking. Now these were socialist writers. Okay, Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells were both socialist writers. We hard-headed practical businessmen must say something sometime, and we don't guess, we've had experience, and we know. So again, incredibly arrogant. And we can tell that he looks down on people like Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. Okay, so because my computer doesn't like uploading big files, I'm going to stop this and then look to part 2.
Okay, so that was a little bit lengthy, I appreciate, but hopefully you have now got a really clear idea about what Mr Birling is saying in his speech. So I'm just going to pop the PowerPoint back up. Hopefully it should load. So what we have here then is this mention of the trade union strikes, possible labour trouble in the near future, talking about World War and also World War II. Some people say war's inevitable, and to that I say fiddlesticks. The Titanic, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. And then, of course, referring to the 1940s, in the middle of World War II, as there'll be peace and prosperity. All of these things, as mentioned, Strange referring to myself in the clip, in the clip we watched, mentioned that everything is presenting Mr Birling as very, very foolish and very arrogant. So why then? Why does Priestley refer to these events, knowing an audience in 1946 would know Mr Birling was wrong? What impression does this give us of Mr Birling, and how does this link to Priestley's intentions? So I'd like you to pause the video and have a go at answering those two questions, please. So what are Priestley's intentions? Well, we know Mr Birling symbolises, he represents capitalism, and we know that Priestley is against capitalism because he feels that it focuses on this individualist attitude of just protecting yourself and your own wealth, and what it does is it widens the divide between the rich and the poor, and that the rich become rich at the expense of the poor. And he believed that there was too much inequality in society. So if Mr Birling represents capitalism, and Priestley wants us to change our views on capitalism being a good thing, then he needs to make Mr Birling incredibly dislikable. So we need to dislike Mr Birling, and we need to think that everything he says is wrong. So Priestley really cleverly manipulates his audience through using all of this dramatic irony of Mr Birling having the wrong opinion of all of these historical events, and the audience would know, as Mr Birling is speaking, they would know everything Mr Birling is saying is the complete opposite to what actually happened. So if Mr Birling is wrong about all of these things, then his capitalist ideology, his capitalist views must be wrong too. So that is what Priestley is doing here, and I would argue that he does it very successfully, because Mr Birling does come across as a complete plonker. So what I would like you to do to end this lesson then is just summarise, how is Mr Birling presented as an individualist in this speech? So how is he presented as a capitalist? How is he presented as only caring about his own individual self and family and situation? Okay, well done, and I will see you tomorrow.